Julian Barton had never been a man of impulse. Every decision he made, every repair in his shop, every customer he took on, every investment, every argument avoided, was the result of years spent learning the value of measured responses. For 23 years, he'd run a successful repair and restoration workshop in Portland, focusing on vintage automotive parts. His reputation wasn't just built on skill, but on reliability. People trusted him. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't rush. He didn't let things escalate. When others pushed, Julian simply stepped back, waited for the pressure to ease, and moved with calculated precision, which made it all the more disorienting when, in the late spring of last year, he did something entirely out of character. He left the city without a plan and drove 4 hours south to the edge of a near-forgotten piece of land by the water. The place wasn't much. A jagged road sloped down through thick brush into what used to be a logging trail, overgrown and half-eaten by moss and thyme. At the end of it stood a clearing by a deep lake, a private parcel that once belonged to a church camp but had since been parceled out and sold. The land bordered a high-end residential enclave on the northern ridge, the kind of place with groomed hedges, coordinated mailboxes, and too many bylaws. But the lake's southern edge remained untouched. Wild, uneven, raw. Julian's longtime acquaintance, a retired forest ranger named Clay, had inherited part of it, nearly 2 acres of brush, rock, and shoreline. He hadn't built anything on it, didn't need to, didn't care. Clay used it to fish every few weeks, nothing more. When Julian called and asked if he could rent it for the summer, Clay didn't hesitate. "You clear the old path and don't set the woods on fire, and it's yours," he said. The paperwork was simple, the agreement legal. No houses, no foundations, just a canvas tent, a propane stove, and room to breathe. And that was all Julian wanted. Space to sleep without an engine idling 2 streets over. Time to read without the weight of emails piling up by the hour. Mornings to fish, afternoons to tinker, evenings to sit under open sky and think. He wasn't here to live off-grid or post about solitude. He didn't film his meals. He didn't turn the experience into a brand. He just wanted to stop moving. So he packed up his truck, loaded his gear, industrial canvas tent, military-grade cot, tools, a small generator, his old fishing gear, and a battered folding table, and drove out on a Wednesday morning while the city was still wrapped in drizzle. The first 2 days passed with a kind of clean silence that Julian hadn't felt in years. He set up the tent, laid a weather-resistant platform beneath it, cleared a fire ring, and rigged a solar panel for his lamp and electric kettle. There was no cell reception beyond a single dead zone near the ridge, which suited him fine. He wrote notes by hand, cooked from cans and cast iron, and adjusted quickly to the deep quiet. The lake stretched out behind him like a black mirror, untouched. The nearest house was nearly a mile away, an angular, all-glass monstrosity perched just high enough to peek over the trees like it owned the place. At night, Julian could sometimes see its windows glowing through the forest, but he never saw people. No one spoke, no footsteps, just the occasional echo of wind, the distant flutter of the blinds, or a car door closing too quietly to provoke interest. It felt like being watched by a house that had no reason to blink. On the 3rd day, Julian returned from a short walk along the western shoreline to find something strange. His folding chair had been moved. It was subtle. The angle was different. The distance from the fire pit shifted. He hadn't left it like that. His gear was untouched, nothing stolen or overturned, but the shift was unmistakable. And near the base of the closest pine, barely visible beneath a scatter of moss, was a torn slip of paper. Unauthorized use of private space. Remove structure immediately. No seal, no signature, no formal letterhead. Just thick black ink in block capital letters printed on heavy stock. At first, he thought it was a prank. Maybe kids from the nearby houses, bored or nosy, but something about the wording didn't sit right. It didn't sound like a joke. It sounded like someone who'd written that kind of warning before, someone comfortable making veiled threats sound like regulations. He checked the land boundary again. According to his map, his camp sat fully within Clay's parcel, with at least 150 feet between his tent and the closest adjoining property line. He had GPS pins, county records, and even the original deed copy. There was no mistake. He wasn't trespassing. No question. But someone clearly thought he was. He called Clay that night, explained the note, and heard him sigh on the other end of the line. "That'll be them," Clay muttered. "The folks on the ridge. They've been poking around since March, asking questions about water aesthetics and shoreline integrity. They wanted to buy up the last lots along the lake, yours included." I told them no. Guess they didn't take it well. Julian pressed for more, but Clay didn't elaborate. "Don't let 'em scare you," he added. "They talk big, but they're just afraid of losing control of the view." The next morning, Julian found a chain across the trail where his truck had been parked. It wasn't locked, but the implication was clear. You're not welcome here. He moved it aside, drove to town for supplies, and bought a trail camera. Nothing paranoid, just sensible. He mounted it discreetly near the camp's entrance, covering the path where the chair had been moved. He wasn't looking for a fight. He wasn't here to prove anything. But if someone was going to keep crossing the line, he wanted a record. He didn't need to wait long. 2 days later, he returned from fishing to find that the entire tent had been unzipped, carefully, deliberately, and left open. His cot was bare, his gear moved, though nothing missing. A deliberate act of intrusion, not theft. Next to the fire ring, a new paper had been nailed into the bark of the same pine. Final notice. Camping prohibited. Return to city property. This time, the font was cleaner. The message shorter. No official emblem, no legal reference. Just arrogance dressed up as authority. That night, Julian sat by the fire longer than usual. He didn't speak, didn't curse, didn't plan revenge. He simply stared out at the lake and listened. The stars were out. The wind was calm. And behind him, on the ridge, a pair of house lights flicked off one by one, as if satisfied he had gotten the message. But Julian wasn't going anywhere. He didn't back off because someone barked. If they wanted to challenge the legality of his presence, they'd have to do it properly. No anonymous notes. No intimidation. No whispers through the woods. They'd have to come down in the daylight and look him in the eye. And if they didn't... Well, he'd be ready. Julian had been in that clearing for just over a week when things stopped being passive-aggressive and started becoming deliberate. He'd grown up around people who liked control. Landlords, contractors, bankers, even some of the more arrogant clients in his shop who liked to remind him that they knew how things really worked. He'd learned early on that most people didn't need real power to exert pressure, just enough confidence to convince others that resistance would cost too much. So when the first notes appeared, when the folding chair was moved, when the tent was unzipped and left like an invitation to panic, he didn't flinch. But what happened next proved that whoever he was dealing with wasn't going to be satisfied with veiled suggestions or staged intimidation. They wanted submission. They wanted him out. It was a Sunday morning when he found the first sign that his time in the clearing had become an actual problem for someone. He'd driven into town the previous day to restock basic supplies, propane, batteries, a new tarp, and coffee. When he returned, he noticed something strange. The road leading down to the camp, a narrow, unpaved lane barely wide enough for one vehicle, had been blocked not with a chain this time, but with 2 fresh concrete parking curbs laid across the width of the trail. They weren't old. The concrete was still lightly dusted with powder, with no sign of moss or weathering. They'd been placed deliberately, side by side, like silent tombstones designed to say, "This isn't your road anymore." On one of them, someone had used black spray paint to write a single word: restricted. in tall, sloppy letters that looked rushed, like they were painted in anger. Julian stopped the truck just short of them and got out. He examined the curbs, then checked the trail's edges. No construction permits, no warning signs, no flagging tape. Just 2 concrete slabs, newly set down in a place where no vehicle could pass without either extreme effort or turning back. He stood still for a long time, hands on his hips, not angry, yet, but focused. Someone had taken the time and resources to haul these heavy objects down this trail, probably with a flatbed or off-road vehicle. They'd gone out of their way to avoid being seen, and they wanted him to know it. This wasn't petty vandalism or kids playing games. This was calculated obstruction, a message written in stone. He didn't try to move them immediately. Instead, he took pictures, detailed ones, wide angles, close-ups, even a few with his boot next to the paint for scale. Then he checked the GPS coordinates on his phone and sent everything to Clay with a short message. "We need to talk." Clay responded within the hour and agreed to meet him in town the next morning. So Julian drove back to camp, now forced to leave the truck up the trail and hike the rest of the way in. It wasn't far, maybe 15 minutes on foot, but the weight of the message clung to his back like humidity. The clearing hadn't changed. His tent still stood. His tools were untouched, but the mood had shifted. The silence didn't feel serene anymore. It felt tight, watched, like the woods were waiting for him to do something wrong. That night, he built a higher fire than usual and let it burn longer. He didn't expect it to scare anyone, but it helped remind him that he was still here, still visible, still grounded in fact and law. He slept with a knife tucked near his cot, not because he felt unsafe, but because he didn't want to be caught unaware. And in the morning, he drove into town and met Clay outside the old gas station where the coffee tasted like oil and the locals never smiled at newcomers. Clay had brought a binder with him, an actual paper binder full of land records, surveys, and tax assessments. He opened it on the hood of his truck, flipped through a few laminated pages, and jabbed a finger at a highlighted diagram. "This is the parcel line," he said. "Your camp sits right here. The trail you're using is on this strip," he pointed again, which was originally owned by the Tinker Creek Logging Co. They dissolved 20 years ago. No one paid taxes on the road since, and it reverted to the county. Julian frowned. "So does the county own it now?" "Not exactly," Clay said. "The county auctioned it last fall in a bulk lot with other reclaimed properties, land they didn't want to maintain. And guess who bought it?" He flipped to a photocopy of the deed transfer. The name listed wasn't a company. It was a person, Marcia Renee Talbot. Julian didn't recognize it. "She lives up there," Clay added. "One of the newer homes. Moved in 2 years ago. Been pestering everyone since. Claims she's organizing view protection initiatives on behalf of the Ridge residents." Julian exhaled slowly. "So she owns the trail?" "She owns the land under it," Clay clarified. "But there's no legal structure, no easement enforcement filed, nothing that gives her the right to block it off without going through the proper process." He tapped the photo of the curbs. This is illegal obstruction. You have every right to contest it." Julian nodded. "Then I'll do that. But I'm not playing cat and mouse. I'm not sneaking in and out of my camp. She's crossed a line." Clay looked at him, serious now. "I'll help you file the complaint. I'll give you my affidavit. But you need to know something. People up there, some of them think they're building a private resort. They act like they own the whole lake. They've gotten away with things because no one wants to waste time or money fighting them." Julian didn't answer right away. He looked past the road toward the hills. They picked the wrong person this time. That afternoon, Julian filed a formal notice of obstruction with the county planning office. He provided photos, location data, and Clay's statement. The clerk took it seriously. Apparently, he wasn't the first to report proactive landscaping by Ridge residents. He was told the complaint would be reviewed within 10 business days. That was fine. Julian didn't need immediate action. He just needed paper. Paper changed everything. 2 days later, the concrete curbs vanished, quietly, without ceremony or apology. He returned from a morning walk to find the trail clear, the dirt still freshly disturbed from where they'd been dragged away. In their place was a sign, bolted to a wooden stake that read, "Private Access Road. Used by non-resident subject to removal." This time, the wording was legalese light. Not quite a threat, not quite enforceable. But it was a step forward in tone. Less brute force, more bureaucracy. Julian took the sign down. Not out of anger, just principle. He didn't damage it, he didn't break it. He simply removed the bolts, rolled it up, and set it aside in case someone asked about it later. He kept a record. He took more pictures. And then, 3 days after the sign incident, he filed for a temporary use easement, an obscure legal move that would allow him full access to the trail during the investigation period. He wasn't a lawyer, but he didn't need to be. He just had to follow the rules better than the people trying to bend them. And that, ultimately, was the shift that triggered everything else. Because the moment Julian pushed back, not with shouting or threats, but with paperwork and precision, he stopped being an inconvenience and became a liability. And people like Marcia Talbot didn't like liabilities on their horizon. They liked control. They liked silence. And Julian had just proven he could be neither. By the time Julian had secured the temporary easement and dismantled the sign without a word, the dynamic between him and the residents on the ridge had already shifted into something heavier, more calculated, and far less polite. He had thought, perhaps naively, that standing his ground through proper channels, filing the complaints, collecting documentation, moving deliberately, might discourage further interference. He wasn't asking for a fight, only space. But entitlement doesn't respond to process, and his quiet resistance had done more than frustrate their strategy. It had undermined it. The residents had likely assumed he'd leave after the first note or after the concrete, or, at the very least, after his truck was blocked and his tent unzipped like a silent warning. But he hadn't left. He'd cleared their barricades, outmaneuvered their signage, and put paperwork into motion that reasserted his right to access. For a man like Julian, that was the whole point, to own your decisions in full view of whoever tried to take them from you. But for people like them, that was escalation, and what came next made that distinction impossible to ignore. It began the following week, when Julian noticed 2 unfamiliar vehicles parked just past the turnoff from the Ridge Road. One was a black SUV with out-of-state plates and tinted windows. The other was an unmarked white pickup with orange safety cones tossed carelessly in the back. Neither vehicle belonged to Clay, and they certainly didn't belong to any of the few seasonal hikers who sometimes wandered into the area. The SUV idled for nearly an hour before driving off slowly, making no attempt to mask its observation. The truck returned the next day and parked across the entrance to the trail again, not blocking access this time, but present, like a placeholder for someone else. Julian didn't confront either driver. He didn't take pictures. He simply watched from the shade of the tree line, cataloging movements, reading license plates, memorizing habits. He'd dealt with this kind of maneuvering before, not from neighbors but from local contractors who'd try to pressure him into giving up restoration jobs by crowding him with trucks or intentionally delaying delivery schedules. It was always the same tactic. Make someone uncomfortable enough to leave voluntarily so you never have to actually force them. 3 days later, things moved past inconvenience. That morning, Julian had gone to town for supplies and to check in with the planning department, where his temporary easement was now officially logged and under review. He returned in the early afternoon, unloaded groceries, and walked down to the lake to check the canoe that Clay had loaned him. As he approached the edge of the dock, little more than a few planks of weathered pine extending 6 feet into the water, he stopped. Something smelled off. It wasn't just lake musk or rotting vegetation. It was chemical, pungent, oily. He crouched, dipped his fingers just below the surface, and brought them up with a thin, slick film glinting in the sunlight. His stomach turned, not from nausea, but from recognition. Someone had dumped diesel into the water. Not a lot, but enough to spread across the shallows like a wound. Enough to kill small fish. Enough to make anyone walking by assume negligence or pollution. And enough to attract the attention of environmental regulators if someone were to report it. Julian stood there for a long minute, hands at his sides, looking down at the iridescent sheen crawling across the lake's edge. Then he looked up. Above the ridge, just visible through the trees, were the windows of the nearest house, tinted, angled, expressionless. He didn't see movement, but he didn't need to. The message was clear. If paperwork hadn't been enough to push him out, maybe suspicion would be. Maybe a contamination complaint would paint him as careless. Maybe enough of these incidents would stack against his presence until his position, legal or not, became untenable. He returned to camp without a word, made notes, and called the county environmental services. He didn't accuse. He simply reported what he found and requested an inspection. He knew how to speak their language, neutral, technical, precise. The man on the phone thanked him and promised to send someone within the week. That evening, Julian walked the edge of the trail with a flashlight and found 2 small plastic canisters buried beneath pine needles 50 yards from the dock. One was empty. The other had a few ounces left inside. He didn't touch them. He flagged the location with orange cloth and logged the GPS. The next morning, he called again and updated the report. On the 3rd day, the inspector arrived. A soft-spoken man in his late 40s named Randall who wore hiking boots and carried a leather-bound clipboard like it weighed 100 pounds. Julian walked him through the sequence, pointed out the canisters, and showed him where the slick had been. Randall nodded often, but spoke little. After 2 hours, he packed up his kit, shook Julian's hand, and said, "We'll be filing a report within 5 business days. This wasn't natural. You were right to call." The following evening, while returning from the ridge trail, Julian found a dead raccoon laid across his fire pit. Its fur was wet, its limbs stiff, and its eyes open and glassy. It hadn't been mauled. It had been placed, carefully, purposefully, like a centerpiece. There was no sign of predation, no blood, no signs of rot or decay. Just death, posed like a warning. Julian stood over it for a moment, then fetched a shovel, dug a hole 30 yards into the woods, and buried it without ceremony. He didn't tell Clay. He didn't call anyone. But that night he moved his cot farther into the tent and locked the zip from the inside. Not because he feared for his safety. He didn't, but because something had shifted. The rules had changed. This wasn't about pushing anymore. It was about claiming. The escalation continued in quieter ways. People he didn't know began hiking near the camp in pairs. Fit, dressed in matching gear, silent. They never waved. They never acknowledged him. Just passed by like they were measuring angles. Someone posted a flyer at the ranger station bulletin board offering a community cleanup of Southern Lake debris, and listed the date Julian had filed for his full easement. His name wasn't on it, but the implication was obvious. An organized move to demonstrate civic presence, thinly veiled occupation under the banner of concern. Clay removed the flyer himself. "You need to understand," he said over the phone. "These people don't care about property lines. They care about who gets to decide what beauty looks like." Julian didn't respond. He didn't need to. Instead, he made his own move. He called his lawyer, not a high-powered litigator from the city, but a steady, semi-retired attorney named Marion, whom he'd used for years to file small claims and contract reviews. He explained the situation, sent copies of everything, photos, GPS logs, correspondence, even the canister's location and the inspector's upcoming report. Marion didn't react with drama or outrage. She simply said, "This is bigger than trespassing. You need leverage." And 3 days later, she delivered it. Julian filed for acquisition of the access road under quiet title. Through a narrow legal channel, and thanks to Marcia Talbot's mistake of using a personal purchase instead of forming a legal trust, he had grounds to contest her ownership of the land under the road due to lack of maintenance and attempted unlawful obstruction. The claim wouldn't win quickly, but it was enough to freeze her authority, enough to make her step back and reconsider. And while the claim was reviewed, Julian did one more thing. He built a small toll booth. Nothing fancy, just a cedar structure with a sliding window and a hand-painted sign, "Temporary Road Management. Entry upon request. No fees, no locks." No threats, just presence, just proof, just a marker that someone now had a reason to stay. Because when control shifts in the open, it doesn't need violence. It just needs permanence. And Julian had finally given them something permanent to fear. The appearance of the toll booth changed everything. Not because it blocked anyone, nor because it was built to intimidate, but because it asserted something that people like Marcia and her neighbors had long taken for granted: the assumption that no one would ever challenge their claim to dominance. Up until that moment, all their maneuvering had relied on ambiguity. Their strength wasn't in law or ownership, but in projection, projecting authority, unity, legitimacy, and moral high ground. But the moment Julian installed that cedar-framed booth and painted a sign not with threats or restrictions but with orderly, bureaucratic language, he took their most powerful weapon and turned it against them. Now, the suggestion of control came from him, and it was backed not just by stubbornness but by law, documentation, and presence. They'd tried to make him invisible. He responded by becoming immovable. For the next 2 weeks, the ridge stayed quiet. No trucks, no notes, no patrols of hikers. The silence returned, but it wasn't the peaceful quiet that Julian had once found restorative. It was something tighter, pulled like wire beneath skin. Everyone was waiting. The case regarding the access road was in motion now, and the inspector's final report on the environmental contamination had been formally filed. The county confirmed that a deliberate petroleum spill had occurred and listed the source as undetermined human intervention. That phrase alone was enough to trigger a limited investigation, and with it came an unexpected knock at Julian's tent one morning. A woman introduced herself as Deputy Investigator Hensley from the Department of Environmental Oversight. She wasn't wearing a uniform, only jeans and a windbreaker, but her badge and tone were unmistakably official. She wasn't there to interrogate Julian. She made that clear from the start. "You're the one who reported the spill," she said. "We're here to figure out who didn't want that report made." She spent the next 3 hours walking the area, asking methodical questions, and taking more samples from around the shore. Julian answered calmly, showed her where he'd found the canisters, and handed her printed photos of the tracks from the flatbed that had placed the concrete blocks. She didn't smile, didn't joke, didn't soften the weight of her presence. But before she left, she turned to him and said, "You've got a lot of eyes on you, Mr. Barton. Not all of them friendly. You keep your documents close, and keep copies in 2 different places." That night, Julian scanned everything he had. Again. He uploaded the files to a secure cloud folder and sent read-only access to Marion, his lawyer. He then made 2 flash drive copies and placed them in different locations on the property. One in a waterproof container behind the firewood stack, the other buried under a marked stone near the canoe. He didn't expect sabotage, but after the dead raccoon, the fuel slick, and the growing coordination on the ridge, he no longer assumed that the fight would remain civil. A week passed, and then came the mediation request. Officially, it was framed as a discussion of access rights and land use expectations, but Julian recognized the tactic. It was an attempt to force a settlement before the county could rule on the quiet title claim. Marion received the invitation first and called him immediately. "They're scared," she said. "They wouldn't come to the table unless they were trying to stop the process before it rules in your favor. The moment the court affirms your easement, their leverage dies. They're trying to spin the optics while they still have time." Julian asked if he should refuse. Marion paused. "No," she said. "You go, but you bring everything. Maps, letters, photos, timestamps, and don't let them pretend this is neighborly. This is negotiation. You're not asking for permission. You're deciding how loud to win." The mediation was held at a local civic building, neutral ground. Julian arrived 10 minutes early, dressed plainly, carrying a single leather satchel. When he entered the room, 3 people were already seated. 2 he didn't recognize. The third was Marcia Talbot. She wore her usual armor, cream blazer, flawless posture, and a look of calm indignation perfected over years of PTA meetings and committee chairs. She didn't greet him. She didn't even nod. The mediator, a gray-haired man with a firm handshake and a clipboard, introduced himself, then gestured for everyone to sit. The meeting began with polite language, but within 5 minutes it was clear that this wasn't an attempt at compromise. It was a performance. Marcia spoke in phrases like the preservation of natural harmony, community safety concerns, and unregulated activity at the lake. She presented an unofficial letter, signed by several Ridge residents, claiming that Julian's presence had disrupted the long-standing expectations of tranquility and visual consistency in the area. She even referenced the toll booth as a symbolic encroachment upon collective enjoyment of the landscape. Julian waited until she was finished, then laid out his documents one by one. The land agreement with Clay, the road access claim, the easement filing, the inspector's contamination report, the photos of the diesel slick, the positioning of the concrete curbs, the absence of any legal citation on the warnings, and finally the full record of communications he'd received, or, more precisely, the lack thereof. When he finished, he didn't make a speech. He simply said, "I have not violated any law. I have not entered anyone's property. I have not endangered anyone. I have only protected my legal access, my agreement with the landowner, and my right to remain without harassment." The mediator looked between them and took notes. No verdict was offered. No agreement was reached. But when the session ended, Marcia stood and for the first time looked Julian in the eye. Her voice was calm, almost rehearsed. "You don't belong here," she said. "You know that. You've made your point. But this place will outlast your determination. You'll leave eventually. They always do." Julian didn't answer. He simply picked up his satchel, nodded once to the mediator, and walked out. Outside, the air was sharp, clean. He didn't look back. He knew what she meant, of course. It wasn't about land. It was about belonging. To people like Marcia, ownership meant more than deeds and boundaries. It meant participation in a curated ecosystem, a space sanitized of dissent. But what she didn't understand was that Julian had already outlasted every method they had tried to push him. The rules had changed. The documents had been filed. The toll booth stood. And the lake was no longer a mirror for their comfort. It had become a line. And he was standing on the other side of it, not by chance but by design. Julian had walked out of that mediation room with the kind of clarity that doesn't come from victory, but from the cold realization that his presence had ceased to be an annoyance and had become, in the eyes of the Ridge community, a personal affront to their image of dominance. For them, the lake wasn't just a geographical feature or a shared view. It was an unspoken symbol of their curated order, a natural asset they'd mentally annexed years before his tent ever touched soil. He had arrived quietly, stayed legally, and refused to move. 3 acts which in their world amounted to defiance. And defiance, to people like Marcia and her neighbors, demanded response. Not compromise, not conversation, but escalation. Something meant to break resolve, erode confidence, isolate by attrition. And over the next 3 weeks, that's exactly what they attempted to do. It began with noise. Not the kind of obvious direct aggression that could be called in as a disturbance, but a more subtle psychological warfare, timed and curated. Twice a week, usually on Wednesdays and Saturdays between 2 and 4 in the morning, a deep, low-frequency hum would start somewhere in the trees above the clearing. It wasn't loud, but it was felt, an intrusive vibration that penetrated canvas and skin alike. Julian couldn't trace the source. It would last 20, maybe 30 minutes, then stop abruptly. No lights, no motion, no response when he stepped into the woods. The first time, he thought it might have been industrial activity on the far side of the lake, but by the third occurrence he recognized the pattern. It was directed, deliberate, and clearly engineered for its effect. Disruption without evidence. Then came the hikers again. They returned, not in pairs this time, but in rotating groups of 3 or 4, dressed like casual campers, all with similar gear and demeanor. Silent, steady, never veering from the path, but always walking just close enough to his perimeter to be noticed. They never acknowledged him directly, but one of them, a tall man with a red bandana and mirrored sunglasses, began whistling the same 3-note pattern each time he passed. It wasn't melodic. It wasn't cheerful. It was a rhythm. Short, long short, sharp, just loud enough to pierce the air and fade. Julian logged each visit in a small notebook. Dates, times, group sizes, weather conditions. Not because he planned to act on the information, but because it was the only way to hold on to a sense of structure. He understood the tactic. Repetition creates weight. Patterns breed fatigue, and fatigue breaks judgment. A few days later, the toll booth was vandalized. Not destroyed, not torched, just defaced in a way meant to humiliate. Someone had poured motor oil down the side of the window and nailed a plastic doll's head to the corner post. The head had been burned slightly around the eyes, the hair melted into sticky clumps. No words, no symbols, just that disturbing object waiting in the morning light like a primitive warning. Julian didn't touch it immediately. He stood beside it for several minutes, then pulled out his phone and took a slow, deliberate video from every angle. After documenting it, he removed the doll, cleaned the booth, and left the oil-stained wood as it was. A reminder, not of fear, but of visibility. Someone had wanted to be seen. He intended to make sure they were. When Marion received the footage, she called within the hour. "They're testing your threshold," she said. "They're baiting you. Don't retaliate. Don't call it vandalism. File it under trespass and send it to the sheriff." Julian agreed. He submitted the footage, and for the first time, a deputy arrived at the camp in person. Not with accusations, but with questions. The man was professional, young, and slightly nervous. He asked about the footage, took photos of the area, and left without promising much. Julian didn't expect arrests. He wasn't building a case. He was building a timeline. But it was what happened 3 nights later that changed the stakes entirely. Julian had gone to sleep around midnight, the fire low, the generator off, the woods silent. Around 3:30 a.m., a crash jolted him upright. Not a branch, not wind. Metal. He grabbed his flashlight, unzipped the tent, and stepped outside. At the toll booth, the sliding window had been shattered, glass scattered across the ground. The structure tilted slightly as if someone had tried to yank it off its foundation. But that wasn't what made him stop mid-step. It was the symbol. Painted in dark red, too thick to be spray paint, too thin to be blood, on the side of the booth was a circle with a single slash through it. Vertical, clean, precise. He'd seen the symbol once before, years ago, during a case in which a local business had been pressured to sell their lot to a development group. It wasn't a gang tag. It wasn't graffiti. It was a private marker, used by certain corporate security consultants to denote contested asset. It wasn't public. It wasn't meant for police. It was a message between players, a sign that someone, somewhere had decided the conflict was now strategic. Julian called Marion before sunrise. She didn't hesitate. "You need someone down there," she said. "Not police, not friends. A buffer." By noon, she had arranged for a retired security contractor named Watts to visit the property. Watts wasn't armed, wasn't flashy. He looked like a building inspector and moved like a man who didn't need permission. He walked the entire perimeter with Julian, examined the booth, reviewed the footage, and then asked a single question. "Do you want this to end quickly or properly?" Julian said, "Properly." Watts nodded. "Then we document. We stay seen. We don't provoke. And when they step out of bounds again, which they will, we escalate legally." From that day forward, Watts visited the camp twice a week, staying overnight when he felt something brewing. He brought with him equipment Julian hadn't considered: motion sensors, battery-powered perimeter lights, a mobile signal repeater. Not to fortify the camp, but to make it unmistakably watched. Invisibility had been their advantage. He stripped it from them. And within 10 days, the pressure stopped. No more hums, no more dolls, no more symbols. But silence, as Julian had learned, is rarely a retreat. It's a recalibration, and it came in the form of legal summons, filed not in the local county, but in a neighboring jurisdiction known for development ties. The Ridge Association, backed now by a corporate entity registered only 3 months prior, claimed that Julian's presence constituted commercial obstruction and unlicensed occupation of a protected visual corridor. It was pure fabrication, but dangerous in the right court. Marion's voice was calm when she read through the documents. "They've brought in capital," she said. "This is the real fight. We file to dismiss on jurisdiction. We counterfile for damages, and we force them into the daylight." Julian agreed, but he also knew one more thing. Now it was no longer about peace, it was about precedent. They didn't just want him gone. They wanted to prove that people like him could be removed, and that, above all else, was something he could never allow. The lawsuit shifted everything, not just in tone, but in momentum. Julian had expected resistance. He had expected threats, graffiti, even staged confrontations. But what he hadn't anticipated was the cold efficiency of a sweat, crafted not to win on merit, but to exhaust by process. The corporate entity behind the Ridge Association, which now called itself Lakeshore Stewardship Initiative, LLC, had money, access, and no emotional investment in optics. They didn't have to win a judgment. They simply had to bleed Julian into submission through delays, filings, and overlapping jurisdictional motions until the cost of staying outweighed the value of holding ground. And in the weeks following the court's acceptance of the claim, that's exactly what began to unfold. The first blow came when the county clerk's office issued a temporary review hold on Julian's easement, citing pending legal clarity regarding commercial activity. Marion, unsurprised, filed an emergency motion for injunctive relief and a dismissal, for jurisdictional overreach, but the message was clear. His access, though not revoked, was now provisional. That same week, a county official visited the clearing, clipboard in hand, asking neutral but loaded questions about land use, structure permanence, waste disposal, and shoreline erosion. The man wasn't rude, but he was exacting, and when he left, he issued Julian a 30-day notice to remove any semi-permanent installations pending the outcome of land adjudication. The booth, the sensor lights, even his tents, extended platform, all classified as questionable. Julian stood in the clearing that evening and looked at the booth. The sign was still intact. The window had been repaired. The toll system, still optional, still unmanned, hadn't been used in over a month. But that didn't matter. This wasn't about what he did. It was about what they could call it. And now, with a court process underway and a corporate front absorbing the risk on the other side, the tactics were no longer about intimidation. They were about leverage through legal attrition. He called Marion that night. "How far does this go?" he asked. Her voice came back dry but focused. "As far as you let them. If you pull out, they'll claim moral victory. If you stay in and lose, they'll tighten the chokehold until they bankrupt you. But if you stay in and win, publicly, loudly, then everything they've built here becomes paper thin." The following morning, Julian received a letter, hand-delivered, not mailed, from the same new corporate name now leading the lawsuit. It was written in neutral legal prose, but the implication was unmistakable. It offered a buyout, a generous one, triple the value of the access path, full reimbursement for any structures built, and a non-disclosure clause. If he signed, the lawsuit would disappear. The harassment would stop. His name would vanish from any permanent record. Clean slate. Julian didn't hesitate. He folded the letter once, placed it in the fire pit, and set it alight. That same night, Watts returned to stay on site. He said nothing about the lawsuit, didn't ask about the offer. Instead, he checked the perimeter, tightened the gate latch, and sat by the fire without a word. After a few minutes, he said, "They made the wrong kind of noise. Now they need to shut it down fast. That means we're getting close." And they were. Because 2 days later, the county judge ruled in favor of Julian's jurisdictional motion. The suit was ordered back to his county. The corporate lawyers tried to appeal, but the delay was brief. Suddenly, everything they'd tried to offshore was now exposed locally, to a system that had already received Julian's prior filings, his evidence, and the environmental report that never made the news but sat in full in the court's archives. The following week brought the final desperate push. It began with sabotage. Julian returned to the clearing from a brief trip to town to find the platform beneath his tent partially dismantled. Screws removed from key joints, braces loosened just enough to collapse under weight. Had he stepped inside without noticing, the flooring would have buckled, possibly injured him. No graffiti, no notes, just the exact kind of harm that causes damage without revealing intent. But what they hadn't known, or had forgotten, was that Watts had installed motion-triggered recorders. Footage showed two individuals approaching the camp at 3:18 a.m., both wearing black, faces partially covered. The video, grainy but clear enough to identify posture and build, showed them moving directly to the platform, working fast, then disappearing up the trail within 6 minutes. Watts delivered the footage directly to the sheriff's office. Within 24 hours, one of the individuals, a grounds maintenance contractor employed by the Ridge community, was taken in for questioning. That was the breach, because for the first time, law enforcement wasn't investigating a complaint filed by Julian. They were acting on a recorded crime. Suddenly, the balance tipped. The sheriff's department issued a warning to the association about interference with private property under litigation. The media, quiet until now, picked up a small piece in a local paper about unauthorized tampering near a disputed easement. Nothing dramatic but visible, enough to register. Then the weather shifted. Storms rolled in. A week of heavy rain and wind battered the lake. Access roads washed out. Drainage failed along the ridgeline. And for 2 days, the only usable entry into the entire northern sector of the lake was the trail Julian controlled, Clay's original access point, the one they had once blocked with concrete and threats. Marcia, or someone acting on her behalf, emailed a formal request to use the trail for emergency vehicle access during restoration. It was worded carefully, with polite gratitude and acknowledgement of existing use complexities. Julian responded within the hour. He approved the access. He set no fee, no terms, only a printed sheet of rules posted on the booth wall, citing the legal easement language, the environmental preservation guidelines, and the penalties for tampering with active infrastructure. Vehicles passed through without incident. No one spoke to him. But he knew what had happened. They had reached the line and stepped back, not out of defeat, but out of necessity. And now, finally, the leverage was his. The rains didn't last, but their consequences lingered. Even after the clouds cleared and the access roads dried, the Ridge community remained strangely quiet. No more late-night visitors, no odd noises, no veiled messages slipped into his path or tacked onto trees like cryptic graffiti. The hum stopped, the hikers vanished, and the man in the mirrored sunglasses didn't return. It wasn't resolution, not in the way people hoped for when they imagined justice wrapped in handcuffs or courtroom scenes, but it was unmistakably surrender in its own refined form. They had stepped back not because they were convinced of Julian's right to be there, but because he had proven he could not be moved without risk. He had survived everything they had thrown at him, not because he was a fighter or because he had outsmarted them at every turn, but because he never let them dictate the terms of engagement. They had written rules to protect themselves, but Julian had read them more carefully, used them with patience, and endured them without flinching. And now they had no further recourse. The quiet was not peace, but it was something close. Julian stayed on the land, the booth still standing, now unremarkable in its presence, weather-worn, slightly faded, but respected. The temporary easement transitioned into a formal one after the case was dismissed and the corporate entity behind the Lakeshore Stewardship Initiative was quietly dissolved. The settlement came not with an apology or an admission of guilt, but with a withdrawal of all claims and a non-disclosure agreement that Julian refused to sign. Marion had smiled when she saw it. "They want this erased," she said. "But it happened. It's part of the record now. It'll be cited the next time they try this with someone else." Julian kept the footage. He kept the documents. He archived everything. Not out of paranoia, but because memory matters when systems try to forget. He never sought revenge. He didn't pursue additional charges, though the sheriff's office offered to escalate the vandalism case. Instead, he wrote a letter, short, formal, and sent it to the association, stating that any further breach of the boundary or misuse of influence would be met with full legal action. It was the last message he ever sent them. Summer came late that year. The lake rose higher than usual, pushing into the shoreline and feeding the marsh grass that framed the edge of Julian's clearing. Clay came by once a month, sometimes twice, always bringing coffee or tools or some part from Julian's shop that needed fixing. They sat in silence more often than they spoke. The dock remained, the canoes still tied and ready. The fish had returned. Not many, but enough to remind him that the water hadn't turned its back on him. He repaired the platform, refinished the booth with a light varnish. He didn't add to it, didn't build a cabin or raise a fence. He left it as it was, a quiet marker that some boundaries didn't need to be declared loudly to be real. One afternoon, while walking the trail, Julian came across a small painted stone left near the toll booth's base. On it, someone had written, "We thought you'd fold. You didn't. Good. No signature, no hint of origin. Just a smooth black rock with clean white lettering, placed like a strange offering, not of friendship, but of reluctant acknowledgement." He left it there. Over time, pine needles gathered around it. He never moved it. Some symbols were worth preserving. He didn't return to the city that year, didn't close the camp. The clearing became less a retreat and more a part of his rotation, a place where he lived, worked, breathed, uninterrupted. People from the ridge still walked the path occasionally, but now they paused at the booth. Some pressed the button, some waved. No one crossed without permission. When the seasons changed and the leaves began to yellow and fall, Julian added one final thing to the booth. A small plaque, bolted beneath the window, plain brass with black-etched letters that read, "Access is a privilege. Respect is a condition. Silence is not compliance. No cameras, no speeches. No hashtags, just presence." He stayed, not to provoke, not to gloat, but because he could, and because sometimes surviving is the clearest form of winning there is.